Gracias a todas, gracias a todos, gracias a todos. It's just absolutely my pleasure and honor to be here. I thank you all so much for coming. I thanks you for the invitation. Really, Latino Dallas and especially Oak Cliff and its environs have made all the difference to what I've been able to do as a scholar. So I'm really fully and eternally indebted to the comunidad, el barrio there. So really, if there's any way I can be of help to you further, please do not hesitate to ask. So as far as the way I'm going to present this today, I'm going to try to make it a little bit more informal and chatty. If the teachers have the sense that it's too formal or too informal, please just send me a message in the chat saying you should do a little bit more of such and such. I'm not, kind of gonna feel insulted. I want to make this relevant for you guys, so please do not hesitate. And also, like in the middle, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to send it in. I just want to be really informal. I want everyone to know that I'm happy to be interrupted, happy to be challenged, happy to whatever. Again, I'm just pleased to be speaking with you. All right, so for the first sort of brief part of the presentation, I'm going to start in Oak Cliff because I start my entire book in Oak Cliff, and it's a single neighborhood, a single barrio, which has really followed and illustrated some much bigger trends in the history of cities and metropolitan areas in America, right? So it was the first place that I began to do this project. A lot of the ways that I think about it come straight out of what I saw sort of on the streets, the building lines, the people, and looking a little bit more at the history. So the big idea, right, of the book is that American cities were in deep, deep, deep trouble for about 30 or 40 years or more. And then one of the things that when cities began to turn around in the early 1990s, I think the most important factor was that about 25 million new people showed up, either coming directly from Latin America or they would come and their kids would be born. But essentially, urban America benefited from an inflow of 25 million new city dwellers. And what I say in the book and in the article is that it's really hard to imagine how many American cities could have possibly pulled themselves out of the depths of the urban crisis. And I'll tell you what that is a little bit. Could have pulled themselves out of the depths of the urban crisis without all these newcomers, all the work they did, all the schools and churches and workplaces that they repopulated, and in particular, the way that they recreated their part of the city. Right? So what I'm going to be essentially doing is talking about how I came to that conclusion and some details. So I'm going to start in Oak Cliff. So back in 1992, there's this journalist named Grover Lewis, and he had grown up in Oak Cliff in the 1940s and 1950s. And he had some very distinct memories of it, which we'll get back to in a second. But this was 1992. And so the editors of Texas Monthly said, hey, could you go back to Oak Cliff and give us a sense of like a memoir, how you remember it, how the neighborhood is doing? And he said, sure. And this guy was really an interesting journalist. He was part of this new generation of what was called gonzo journalism that tried to make what they wrote a little bit more sort of earthy and accessible. So there might be a couple of swear words in here. So I apologize for that. We'll get to that. All right. So when he comes and looks at it in 1992, he contrasts the community as he remembered it. And we'll get back to that. He contrasted the community as he remembered it to what had happened. And he wrote the following. He wrote, the devastation was total. An entire neighborhood sunk in rot. The surviving houses were vine-choked, boarded up, literally atomizing in a ghastly mockery of the thriving community that I recalled. I groped for terms to encompass the scope of the disaster. Systemic collapse, municipal cancer, de facto apartheid, social time bomb, 1,000 points of dark. So essentially what he was describing was, as he saw it, a neighborhood very much in distress. There are a lot of things he did not see, and we'll get back to that as well. But I really want to focus on that sort of sense of distress, because when he looked at abandoned houses and vine-choked yards and streets he thought of as unkempt and dirty, he described it that way because it was part of this much broader trend nationally, right, of the urban crisis. So in brief, what this meant was that American cities, it started mainly in the 1960s and lasted until about the 1990s. So the urban crisis was basically American cities were losing population, they were losing jobs, they were looking at rising crime, and they were looking at municipal bankruptcy. So that's the sort of academic statistical way of explaining it, and I'll come back to it. But what I want to do first is give you a sense of how I experienced it as a little kid. Right now, I lived in New York City, and New York was going through very hard times as well. But the way that I more often experiences it was more or less through the movies. Right, there are a whole bunch of films that used this sort of idea of urban breakdown as a kind of background plot for what they were describing. So let me bring up, if I can, this PowerPoint just to show you a few of the movie posters and whatnot behind it. Let's see here. Okay, better now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So basically, there was a whole bunch of movies that my family didn't have cable, but my friends' families did. So there are a whole bunch of movies that they would show that were sort of based on the idea of cities in big trouble. So one of the earliest ones was this movie, Dirty Harry, right? And it shows Clint Eastwood in San Francisco. And the whole back plot is that there's a serial killer who's, picking people off, and there's a lot of street crime. And the whole sort of plot of the movie is that he has to use his .357 Magnum and shoot a lot of people to make the city right. It was sort of an exciting action film, but underneath it was the idea that cities were totally out of control. So that's from, I think, 1971. 1981, another movie from a neighborhood, I was actually born in the Bronx, another movie called Fort Apache, the Bronx, right? And you can see, like, the movie poster has this caption, 15 minutes from Manhattan, there's a place where even the cops fear to tread, right? It's once again the sense that, okay, there are these police officers dealing in very dangerous neighborhoods. Once again, right, the idea is that these are white police officers, and the danger is often explicitly Black, and in the case of Fort Apache, the Bronx, Puerto Rican or Latino people who are the source of the danger, quote unquote. Right, so that's sort of another one. RoboCop from 1987 was the same thing with Detroit, and it was such a dangerous city. The movie breathlessly expresses it's 1986 or 7 film that the only way that they can patrol Detroit and make it safe is by this fully armored machine pistol wielding cybernetic police officer, right? That's the answer. Again, like a white police officer. But I think the most creative vision of an apocalyptic urban future that everyone was expecting is this movie, Escape from New York, which is from 1982. And it's set in the future, right? The future is 1997. And what has happened is that Manhattan has gotten so dangerous that they've evacuated all the civilian population. They've put walls up around it, and it's become a maximum security prison. And inside, it's not like they're prison guards or any organized thing. They just, like, if you're committed a serious crime, they stick you in there. It's just sort of gang warfare, and whoever can survive, right? So you can really think of this as a completely different way of looking at and expecting things to work in cities, because, of course, right now, like, Manhattan is one of the most expensive places to live in the entire country. Like, a 1-bedroom apartment will cost you like $3,000 a month if you can afford that. So, but so that's sort of what has happened with cities. But what was imagined and expected at that time is the future is going to be totally bleak. Cities are going to be abandoned. And I should say, it wasn't just like the movies. It was like all kinds of specialists in urban affairs were saying, like, this is the future, right? That that the era of the big American city has come and gone. They're going to be gradually abandoned. They're going to become the haunts of, the homeless and criminals and the dispossessed. And that's it. The action is really going to be in the suburbs. Right? Now, again, like, it's sort of easy to look back from the present and say, oh, this was, so silly because, we can now look back and kind of laugh about this. But again, I think it's important to remember that this was totally what was expected. And there was some actual, like, real life basis for this, right? So if you look at the era of the urban crisis, like, the most high profile symptom was crime, right? So there were 943, so in 1991 is when you really see the peak of urban crisis crime. And in 1991, there are 943 homicides in Chicago, 1,025 homicides in Los Angeles, and 2,345 homicides in New York City, where I lived, right? So that's like literally 6 murders every day. So it wasn't as if people were imagining things being pretty tough. They were. Meanwhile, cities were being abandoned, right? The historian Kenneth Jackson, who's sort of a big figure in urban history, said, if you look at the 25 biggest cities in America from 1950 to 1980, right, 18 had lost population. And a lot of cities were totally losing population pretty quick. So over those 30 years, for example, Detroit lost 37% of its residents. Cleveland lost 37%. Trenton, New Jersey loses 28% of its population. That this is fairly fairly common, I should say. By the same token, a lot of cities are losing a lot of their industrial jobs. So for just one example, because I deal with it a lot in the book, Chicago, of the industrial jobs, the manufacturing jobs it has in 1948, half of them are gone by about 1981. And in that year, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune writes a 5-part investigation of what he expects the future to be, and it's just pretty much quotations from specialists saying, this city is done for, right? All the jobs are going to move out to the periphery. So many people are going to move out to the suburbs, and that's just the way it's going to be. Now, essentially, thankfully, that's not what happened, right? That those sort of common expectations that have been sort of floating around there for decades, and that I should say also, even in a sense, peak in that same year that Grover Lewis writes about Oak Cliff. That's the year of the LA. Some people call it riots. Some people call it an uprising, when a bunch of police officers beat a defenseless black driver named Rodney King. He's acquitted by a virtually all-white jury, and people just, because the whole thing was captured on video, there was no question of what they had done. But the fact that the jury acquitted him led to sort of a big uprising and urban demonstration. So a lot of people thought, that's it, the city is done for. But where I pick up the narrative is sort of right in that period to say that there was a counter trend. That, yeah, there were a lot of people moving out of cities, but there are also a lot moving into them. And that's where I get to, all of these migrants and immigrants, first and foremost from Mexico, right? If you sort of look at my book, Mexicanos and Mexican Americans are like the number one population I'm talking about. And, I'm going to pause for a little bit right now just to keep things loose and break up the flow a little bit. What I'll talk about, not the very next presentation, but the one after that, is exactly how they did it, right? Because this is a population that generally had low-income jobs because of discrimination and other reasons. A substantial number of them were undocumented. They were being politically demonized. They were socially marginalized. And yet, they played this totally indispensable role in bringing America back from sort of the brink of urban ruin. So I'll be talking about how they did that. Before that, I'll talk about the Oak Cliff that Grover Lewis remembered, and the little Mexico that was a sort of big main barrio at the time. But let me pause here and see if there are any questions or discussion. And let me see if I can adjust my my view, because I think I'm just looking at there we go.
There is a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you could see it.
Okay. Okay, great question. Why were these cities being abandoned? Was it related to the loss of industrial jobs, the increased crime, or both? That exact question was like the biggest question for urban affairs, for urban history, for about 50 years, right? So that's exactly the right question. There were two main reasons, right? One was essentially deindustrialization, and one was essentially racism, plain and simple, right? And both of these were helped on by tax policy, public policy, and a bunch of other pretty major mistakes that were made. But let me just talk about the two main ones. And let me actually start with the racism, right? Remember that this is an era in which the civil rights movement is really gearing up, right? That's sort of often told in terms of the Brown v. Board of Ed decision in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the sit-ins in 1960, 61, the March on Washington in 1963. Among the various demands that primarily African Americans were making was to say, we just want equality in jobs, in housing, in not being brutalized by the police. And so what this meant at the neighborhood level was that, remember that the vast majority of American cities, definitely including Dallas and definitely including Chicago, the other city I look at in the book, were in effect segregated. Now, in some cases, like in Dallas, there was explicitly a series of ordinances in the 19-teens that specified, this is effectively a white area, this is a black area, this is what they would have called a Spanish or a Spanish American area, but that's mostly Mexican Americans, Chicanos. And the idea was that, once it had been declared in certain ways, this area, there were specific laws saying that you couldn't move into an area that wasn't assigned to you. And there were a whole bunch of bank practices that made it hard to do so. Now, the laws that say, effectively, we're going to segregate the city by positive law, by the power of the government, that's overturned in 1948 by a Supreme Court decision called Shelley v. Kramer, right? So it says all these official segregation laws, you can't enforce those anymore. So what this means is that suddenly a lot of Black people are able to live in, they can buy in neighborhoods that they couldn't before. So if they were packed into, what became known as ghettos for one time, and remember that living there, they were overcharged for rent. They were underserved, everything from trash collection to, water, to in every possible way, those neighborhoods were underserved. They said, hey, I'd like to live in a neighborhood with better facilities, et cetera, and whatnot, right? So as I'll get into it in the next bit, one of those neighborhoods was Oak Cliff, right? This was a all-white neighborhood that had been kind of a bit more of a working class neighborhood with an industrial base. And over the course of the late 40s, the early 50s, small numbers of African American families would buy houses elsewhere in Dallas, and they were met with a series of people burning crosses on their yards when they moved in, people throwing dynamite sticks into their shops during the night, of setting off fireworks, of just threatening them. And in my book, I won't use the language now, but there's a lot of explicitly racist language saying, where white people are saying, if Black people do this, and they didn't call them Black people, right? They use another word, there's going to be a riot. It soon becomes clear, because the city authorities in Dallas are essentially saying, listen, we cannot have riots here. That happened in New Orleans, that happened in other southern cities. It can't happen here because that's wrong and that's bad for business, right? And they actually managed to ease in bus desegregation without violence and without a big boycott in Dallas, the desegregation of the state park and the state fairgrounds, of restaurants and and hotels. So the sort of leaders of Dallas managed to sort of ease into an era of desegregation without the kind of big sort of white riots that you'd see elsewhere. But a lot of white people just did not want to have black neighbors, and so they began to move out, right? And so and again, remember that often the black families moving into white neighborhoods would have the same kinds of jobs or better than the white families around them, right? So it wasn't like, oh, quote unquote, they didn't want poor people in their neighborhood. They were people with exactly the same sorts of incomes. It was just simply they would not live near black people. And that's when places like suburban Dallas and North Dallas get really populated. So that's the sort of the racism story. And you see the same thing in Chicago and LA, pretty much everywhere. The other big thing that's happening is there are government policies that essentially, well, actually, before let's talk about the business policies. For businesses, they always they want cheap labor, right? And so they don't want labor unions, and they don't want higher wages because that costs them money. So they begin, and this begins as early as the 1940s. They'll relocate their big urban factories out to the suburbs or out to small towns because there aren't any unions there, or the unions are weak, or there are people, right, that essentially will work for less money. So essentially that the business class realizes, hey, we can rack up higher profits if we just move out. Now, at the same time, the federal government has created a number of policies which, one, make it very profitable for businesses to relocate like that, and two, only allow certain kinds of people to follow them. So when the jobs move out to the suburbs or to small towns, a lot of people may want to move out there, but only white folks really could, because this is sort of a long story, but essentially mortgage rates used to be like 18% a year. Does anyone know what they are right now? Like 3?
A lot lower, yeah.
Yeah, right. So for years now, it's been in like the 3, 4, 5%. It was not until the federal government stepped in and created a government program of mortgage insurance that those rates started to go way, way down. That was a good thing. However, it was only a good thing for white people, right? Because the rules of the real estate industry and the rules of this government lending program, mortgage insurance, basically said that introducing people who are not sort of naturally part of a community or not, characteristic of a community, if they move in, that's going to drive property values down. So both the private industry and the government guidelines said you shouldn't lend money to them. So that meant that only white people could move out of cities, and they did. So cities suffer dramatic population loss, and living, in cities where jobs are leaving, right? People are sort of commenting in the comments, right, that there are a whole bunch of folks whose parents had to sort of move because they couldn't get a job, keep a job, or stay hired, right? So those are the sort of two main influences that damage cities that way. Now, Hispanos, right, have a kind of interesting intermediate, uncertain role in this whole scene, because they were sort of neither fully white nor fully black. In places like Dallas, there was sort of a triracial way of understanding things. So they kind of were, in a sense, used to Mexicanos because there had been plenty of them in the area for decades or longer. In places like Chicago, where they were used to really just black people and white people, like when, as people have been sort of noting in the comments, like when a Mexican or Puerto Rican person would go into a store, sometimes they were denied service, right? I've got the description here of the no shoes, no shirt, no dogs, no Mexicans. Yeah, that was literally the Dallas Restaurant Association that created that sign. So when you go and see exhibitions of Mexican American history, that some of those signs come from Texas. So there's plenty of discrimination in public places. But the weird thing about it is it wasn't exactly uniform. If you were like lighter skinned or white people thought that you sort of looked acceptable, sometimes they would let people like that in. And in both Dallas and in Chicago, that was sort of a way, interestingly, into the neighborhood. So I have evidence of sort of more European looking Mexican Americans moving into Oak Cliff as early as the 1940s, right? There's this one really big business opens a new restaurant in Oak Cliff in, I think, 1947. And there it was, you have some sort of limited acceptance of some Mexican Americans. Same kind of deal in Chicago. There was another all-white neighborhood that I talk about. It was called South Lawndale, and it was at the edge of a lot of African-American neighborhoods. And there what happened was that local mortgage lenders said, hey, you know what? A lot of white people are leaving this part of the city, and they want to sell their houses to somebody, right? So and these are all white people. And so when they thought in terms of we, right, it was Anglo-Sajones, right? So they'd said, who are we going to sell our houses to? And their solution was, those mortgages that not everyone can get, let's give those to the Mexicans. So there was, again, like a sort of way in. Some, what we today call Latinos, some Mexican Americans can get those mortgages and some can begin to move in. So in both of these neighborhoods, and I should say, this is a nationwide phenomenon, you very often see Latino neighborhoods, or for that matter, Asian American neighborhoods between white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. So we were thought of as sort of, maybe they're okay. They're, in the neighborhood I look at in Chicago, they were like, this is a Catholic neighborhood, they're Catholic, so maybe they're okay, right? But it was sort of a way in that they were partially socially acceptable for that reason. So the urban crisis is stabilized at first in certain places by those first generations of Hispanos moving in. In Chicago, it's in the 1960s. In Oak Cliff, it's primarily in the 1970s. But the intermediate position in terms of how folks understood race is really key to that. All right. Okay. So the one comment about the Central Expressway, I'll get into that in just a sec, because that's going to be the story of how Oak Cliff, rather than Little Mexico, becomes essentially the center of Mexican American Dallas. But we'll get to that in a bit. And we're on the full screen slideshow.
I think it's loading, but
okay.
Yeah, right now we got it.
Okay, great. All right, now when I give talks not in Dallas, I have to tell them where Oak Cliff is, but that's obviously the part of Oak Cliff that I use for my study. And essentially, the story there is that Oak Cliff was it was its own municipality, and they didn't have enough services like water, drainage, electricity, and so they annexed themselves to Dallas in 1903. Basically, they become a part of the city. They're always part of the city that felt a little bit ignored. They felt like they weren't getting all they could out of the government, that were spending all their money downtown. And so Oak Cliff is sort of seen as a little bit of a disappointing, underdeveloped place whose originators thought, hey, this part of town will really grow up fast. And through the 1930s, remember that's the Depression decade, it isn't growing very fast. But things changed dramatically in 1941, because in that year, a thing called the Naval Weapons Industrial Reserve Plant is built about 8 miles to the west of Oak Cliff. Now, this is a massive facility producing armaments, producing planes, later producing missiles, and it's in business for, let me think, from about the 1940s to about the 1980s. Throughout that entire period, it's providing jobs, not just jobs, but really well-paid jobs. So let's pause and remember here that the way that Dallasites often narrate their own history is like, we just had to get up and go we just worked harder at such and such. And be like, well, right, but remember the federal government put a huge factory, and that wasn't the only one, right? During World War II, it really transforms the city because so much federal money out of Washington is spent in Dallas that it sort of creates a lot of opportunities, both for, just for sort of people who want jobs, but also for a whole bunch of electronics firms. So Texas Instruments would never have been there were it not for all of this government investment, because they, when you create a lot of jobs in a place, people with skills, people with degrees, people with certain abilities tend to converge there, and they sort of meet each other and network and start companies later on. So this is kind of a variation of the story of like Silicon Valley. The reason Silicon Valley is there in large part is because the government during World War II poured huge amounts of money into new technologies for fighting the war. And all those people that they attracted there, basically, they then, after the war was over, began to start their own companies. So in Oak Cliff, the Naval Weapons Industrial Reserve Plant creates enormous prosperity. So this is a picture from 1957. That's Jefferson Boulevard. And you can see that there are all these like big companies like Ford and Crest and a bunch of smaller companies just have businesses all up and down that street. I went back, since I'm like a historian, this is the kind of thing we do, and calculated the vacancy rate on commercial properties on Jefferson Boulevard. It was 3%. To give you a sense, even before the pandemic, the vacancy rate got up to like 10-15% in like prime downtown areas. So Oak Cliff, like, people could not open enough businesses. And so what really made the place economically strong was both, again, the mixture of big businesses and then small businesses operating, like everything from a shoe store to a hardware store to an independent like dentist's office, or those kinds of small businesses are essential, right, to Oak Cliff in this era. And again, that works really well, but not for everybody, right? So this is like the champion, I can't remember if it's track or wrestling team from 1962. And as you can see, it's not the most diverse place ever, right? So indeed, when Grover Lewis looks back at the Oak Cliff, he loved it. And again, he loved growing up there in a sense that he talks about the beautiful leafy tunnels and the stately homes there, but he's not romanticizing it, because he also said, and I quote, "The ethos of the place was absolute white supremacy, reinforced by old-time religion and male chauvinist prickism," right? So he's essentially just outright saying, I should say that when he wrote the piece in 1992, it wasn't just like an exercise in nostalgia. The title he gave to it, and this is like a little bit of outdated slang, he called it "Farewell to Cracker Eden." Does anyone know what the term cracker is used to? Yeah, it's like a term for an ignorant and racist white person, basically. So when he calls it in 1992 "Farewell to Cracker Eden," it's like the past of this place is straight up full of white supremacy, but also, just straight up full of considerable prosperity. So again, that's the team. And this is a picture of of the area in 1992, when again, like they've been losing population for decades. It's not really until the latter 1990s that the area sees its first population growth since the 1940s. So again, I'll get back to the Mexicanos and the revitalization, but let me talk a little bit about Little Mexico. So I think we're switching. There we go. Let me go to the stop share. Now, before I talk a little bit about Little Mexico, does anyone have any questions about Old Oak Cliff? Wow. All right. So at this time, right, so since Oak Cliff is literally 95 to 98% non-Hispanic white, the sort of real center of public life and settlement in Dallas was Little Mexico. And basically that's, I'm trying to think of what around where Pike Park is, around, actually, let me go back and see if I have that, if I have a map, because I actually think one of the articles I've got, let's see here. Yeah, there we go. Let me put that up if I can. Share screen. There we go. Okay, can you see that map? Okay, so basically Oak Cliff is down here. Little Mexico is right up here, in Pike Park, as somebody has mentioned, is really the center of that. Now, Pike Park and Little Mexico really got their start as Mexican neighborhoods because of the Mexican Revolution, right? So remember that from 1910 to 1920, there's a rebellion against a sort of autocratic regime of Porfirio Diaz, who has presided over a great deal of privatization and exploitation of Mexican workers. There's great privation, especially in the far north and the south, and that's where people like Emiliano Zapata really sort of get their start as revolutionaries. So there is a civil war going on, effectively, and it's a very violent one. Like about 1 million people or more are killed. And so a lot of Mexicanos are just saying, like, I just want to like farm or edit a newspaper or just live, but I can't with these, both government forces and rebels running through my community. So tens or maybe 100,000 or more migrate across the border to Texas. Now, of course, there have been Mexicans crossing back and forth over the U.S.-Mexico border for decades, ever since it was created in 1848, right? So that phrase, "we didn't cross the border crossed us," was all about the seizure of first of Texas and then of the rest of the U.S. West, which used to be the northern half of Mexico. So there are, between 1 and 200,000 Mexicans that become American citizens in 1848, but they're joined by a great many more. So again, like today, as you know, the overall population of the US is almost 20% Latino. It's hard to remember that figure was more like 1 or 2% for everywhere from like 1848 to probably about 1920 or thereabouts. All right. Until about 1910. So Little Mexico becomes a pretty thriving Mexican communities, where the Mexican community. And so I have, a lot of accounts about that. One figure, Anita Martinez, who was the first Latina member of the city council. She was born in Little Mexico in 1925. And sort of remembered it as, both a neighborhood that was very happy, but also fairly poor. But that was the home of a whole bunch of important neighborhood institutions, a church, a heavily, Mexican Catholic church, a school, a business district where people could, get all of the goods, services, education, housing they needed in Spanish just as well as English. And so for decades, it's again the center of community, and that lasts into the 20th century, right? So I have a guy named Jesse Tafalla who has, since unfortunately passed away, but he said, that was the center of town for us. If anyone wanted to know what was going on with Mexican Americans, they'd head straight to Little Mexico, or straight to Pike Park in particular, because that was in effect the plaza. Now, this is important stuff, right? Because remember that all of Spanish settlement in the Americas is built around plazas, right? From going back since 1571, Charles II of Spain promulgated a set of rules called the Leyes de Indias that said, here are the official Spanish imperial rules for setting up any settlement, whether it was a pueblo, a little tiny one, a villa, a sort of middle-sized settlement, or a ciudad. They always had to start with the plaza in the center. And on one side of the plaza was the iglesia, on one side was the cabildo, the city hall, a city town council, and all of the other lots were, if you were one of the leading settlers of a new place, you would both get a lot right on the plaza, which is very prestigious, and you would get a permanent title, right? So that the title Hidalgo, you've probably heard the word, right? There's a county in Texas. The title Hidalgo was given to anybody who was one of the early settlers of one of these new places. So the Spanish Empire in America is built around this. Now, remember, this isn't just the Spanish. They encounter huge, pre-Columbian native civilizations in the Americas, and quite often they put the plaza exactly where the central place of the native people there, the Aztecas, right? The Comanches, the more settled Puebloan people. They also organized their societies around a central place, often where the kiva was. So you had two civilizations, both organizing around, like, you got to have a center of town. And that's what the plaza became. So remember that when there are Mexican origin people living in a part of Texas that was already Mexican for 100 years and Spanish for 200 years before that, there already was a plaza that was sort of natural to them, to their sense of, well, where do you, if you want to go out para dar un paseo, to do anything, you wander down to the plaza and see who's there. Like that's what community meant to them. It wasn't like an abstraction, like when people say, oh, the Latino community in the abstract. They're like, no, the community has to assemble in places and see each other to really feel like a community. So when they're living in places of longtime Mexican or Spanish settlements, there's already a plaza. If they're living somewhere where there wasn't one, they effectively had to make one. And that's what Pike Park effectively became. So it was that for years, but then let's see if I can find this image. Later on, when they were renovating it, they had community meetings saying essentially, so like, what would you like to see in Pike Park? Let's see if I've got an image of this. And they'd essentially say, like, what we really want is Mexican style benches, a kiosco, like if you've got one of those bandstands that is covered, that's in Spanish called a kiosco. That's one of the classic things that you always have in a plaza. So if you go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, if you go to any number of places, there's going to be a plaza, right, and a kiosco. So they rebuild that. So Little Mexico thrives for decades, but then, right, you have a set of plans also coming out of City Hall, which destroys it. And that's quite simply that they start building highways through it, right? Remember that the highway building project of the 1950s was the biggest public works program that had ever been seen in American history. And when they wanted to decide, okay, we want to build this highway to make it easier to get in and out of the city, where do we want to put it? They virtually always put it in a Black or a Mexican American neighborhood, right? Because they thought, well, those people, remember that, there is not an Hispano or a Black person on the Dallas City Council for decades, right? Until like the 1970s or the 1980s. So this whole period, this is an exclusively white city government. And so when they build the Dallas North Tollway, the Central Texas Expressway, they plow one after another right through Little Mexico. And that forces people, sometimes they're forced by the use of eminent domain to move out. Of course, they never get fair value for their properties because all of the people trying to buy things up know, like, this is going to be destroyed. So I can offer you pennies on the dollar. So the fact that starting in the 1950s and moving through the 1970s, the Dallas city government is using, again, federal money to destroy Little Mexico, that's sort of that's what sets the stage for Oak Cliff becoming the sort of new, what the Dallas Morning News is calling by the 21st century, the Latino downtown of Dallas. Let me pause and see if folks have any questions or any follow-ups.
There are a couple comments in the chat, but when exactly did they build the highway that broke up the neighborhood?
Let me think. Let's see if I can find this in my notes. I think it starts in 1956. But essentially, there's a widening of Harry Hines. Then there's the I think the Central Texas Expressway, then the Tollway. Each one of those is built. And remember, these building projects don't happen in just 1 year, the clearing of the ground. So it starts actually as far back as the 1930s, but really becomes like when they punch holes through the middle of the neighborhood, it's the 1950s and 1960s. And there I've got, I went and did a lot of interviews with people who live there. So let's see. Ronnie Villarreal, a very old fellow, he wrote, they cut right through the heart of the Barrio with the Dallas North Tollway. When you cut right through the heart of it, what are you going to do? And he says, we were young at this time. We didn't participate in politics, and they just went through. People were, they were very good people. And his wife, Leonor, broke into the conversation and said, no se sabían defender. Éramos tan inocentes y tan buenos, right? They didn't know how to defend themselves. We were so innocent and so good. And Jesse Tafalla, who sort of later became a prime mover and member of the Dallas Mexican American Historical League, he said, back then we didn't have any recourse. We didn't get our first elected officials until the 1970s. We had no representation. We didn't understand the politics. They just kept us in the barrio. And so, again, that's the kind of background in terms of Little Mexico, what it was, and what happened to it. Let's see, Francisco Medrano. Yeah, Pancho Medrano was a really important guy. If you read, there's a scholar named Brian Benkin who's written some great books. Remember that until the 1960s, under the law, Mexican Americans were technically white, right? That Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the U.S. invasion of Mexico and Mexican War specifically put the new American citizens of Mexican ancestry on the same legal footing as white people. Technically, right? In practice, it did not work out that way. And what you had was generations of gradual seizure of common lands and of land grants given to Hispanos. Those were gradually stripped away from them by rings of corrupt officials, corrupt judges, and real estate operators, right? So the tactic that a lot of these folks used to try to keep their land was to say, technically under the law, right, we are white, right? So we should have the same rights and privileges as other white people. And that's why you should respect our property rights. why you should let us into restaurants, into movie theaters, into public places. And that was the sort of legal tactic, because that's sort of what they had to work with. What that also meant, though, was that in areas where there were both Black people and Latinos, or Hispanos, in this case, Mexican Americans, they often didn't want to work together with them in a common political struggle. So they would say, oh, well, Black people are not legally equal. They were busy saying, we're white, so accept us. And there were really very few Mexican American leaders who said, like, let's make common cause with Black people because they're suffering the same kinds of discrimination that we are, right? For example, and this is sort of one of the things that, even though I'm a historian, I've been doing this for 25 years, I was still shocked by when Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington in 1963. Again, like, this is possibly the greatest speech in American history, definitely the greatest speech of the 20th century. At that time, LULAC, right, the sort of more traditionalist Mexican American civil rights organization, denounced the speech and said, this was too much of a rabble rouser, because their tactic was still to say, oh, no, we're white. We can't make common cause with them. Demonstrations is their thing. We're just going to, be patient and have faith. And now that turns around in the 1960s, especially in the late 1960s. But Medrano was one of the few people, because he came out of the labor movement that said Black workers and brown workers are both workers. And for that matter, he would say white workers, they all have the same interests. What big business and what he might have called the capitalist class, they want to keep us divided so that we cannot unite and demand higher wages and demand safer conditions and demand humane treatment. And so it serves their interest to make white people hate Black people and to make Latinos, Hispanos, feel like they can't work in common with African Americans, right? So that was really an unmistakable part of it. And indeed, sadly, even when there did start to be Hispano representation on the city council in Dallas, often, like, the African American and the Hispano political figures would kind of argue over, oh no, but we want to get a new district for the city council. So that kind of infighting, lasted for decades. It's not entirely over, but that's sort of part of the legacy here. Did the people living in Little Mexico do anything to protest the displacement for their community? There were some small informal protests, but again, like Tafalla said, they often weren't that organized. There'd be like a few protests, but again, this goes back to the structure of Dallas government. In Dallas government at the time, every person on the city council and the mayor was elected citywide, right? So they essentially go to the voters and say, okay, elect 9 people or 11 people. And that meant that every single one of those representatives was a white person. So what had to happen was that essentially people had to sue the Dallas city government and say, you have created a city governmental structure, the purpose of which is to disfranchise Black people and to disfranchise Hispano people. And they actually win a case they start suing in the 80s. They win a case in 1991, whereby the federal government says, you got to reorganize the government, the municipal government. And that's where you get districts, right? So they're like, I forget how many they've expanded to. It was 11 for a while, but you had a city council member elected just from a particular part of the city. So that meant you'd have, like, the African-American parts of the city would most likely elect Black representatives or other representatives who they just thought represented them well. And, with the increase in the Hispano population, the Mexican-American population, you begin to have representation, starting in the 1970s, but really more aggressive representation in the 90s. So it was hard to protest because there were no locally elected public officials, whether Hispano or Anglo or whoever, who were really representing the interests of that part of the city. So those plans just flew right through, and it happened in a lot of cities. There were some cities where those kinds of projects got turned away, but unfortunately not that many.
All right, this is Macario Hernandez. I'm the principal here at Trinity Garza. Appreciate it. Sorry I came late. I wish I was here earlier, but you know how duty calls when they call these emergency meetings.
Of course.
I really admire the fact that you're here, and I'm really excited that the students are here looking at this. And I have history in Little Mexico. You know, that's where the Hernandez Mexican Foods was there. My grandma, I still say, and I'm gonna fight it to the very end, that she was the last living person in downtown Dallas, right there, right by the Hernandez store. She was still boiling her egg at 94 years old there, before she passed away. She went through the Great Depression and everything. So, but I guess one of the pivotal points that I think, and I know you may have already talked about it too, but I think one of the pivotal points that changed for the Latino community there was what happened to Santos Rodriguez. And I don't know if I don't know if you touched that portion or not, but I think that was just a big change where the activism and kind of the social consciousness of the people that were there, it became an awakening of some sort, and a duality kind of it we talk about being woke. The kids talk about, well, everybody woke up when. And I don't know if you shared the story. If that's okay, if I could share it real quick.
Please do. Yeah.
These two kids, these two little brothers that were, I guess this one kid, they were trying to break into a vending machine or something. I guess he stopped them for a vending machine of some sort. And the police, and correct me because I'm with a historian here, so I'm just going based on what I
just the only thing is they were accused of having broken in.
Thank you.
I don't think they did.
That's right. They were accused of breaking into it. And we're talking about chump change, a few dollars or whatever. They were accused of it. And the officers questioned them, I believe, in their own squad car, questioned the two brothers and start playing a game called Russian roulette. Now, I don't know if Russian roulette or something of that nature is where, the officer will roll the guns, the old school guns that roll. And if you don't tell me the truth that you did this or you didn't do this, we're going to make this long story short, he shot the kid right in the head, right in front of his own brother. And I think he maybe served 2 days in jail or at the most, or he served 2 years in jail at most. I don't know if he served any time, to be quite honest. I'll let the historians share that. But nothing happened about it. It was just blown under the car. They tried to blow it under the rug, but it woke up the Little Mexico. It woke up the community, and protests happened. Demonstrations happened. We started City Hall. So there started to be this new kind of, it was like a tipping point in the community for the Latinos in Little Mexico. But I'll let you, I started my whole dissertation with that story because it was transformational, because I talk about, an intergenerational consciousness, so that the way I am today is because of my father who was protesting, my grandfather who was on the streets who helped fund the protest. And this is just something that we live with and we try to take in our present day life. But I'll let you, if just want to get some feedback, or if Mr. Macias or Mr. Estevez want to chime in, or the professor.
I'm just going to let everyone know where they can find some more details in Dr. Sandoval's book. It's on page 126. But yeah, I'll let Dr. Sandoval take over.
It was indeed one of the most important moments in the history of Mexican Americans in Dallas in 1973, because there had been plenty of police abuse, but this was just so clearly, horribly, unmistakably that these officers had been trying to force these kids to confess to a crime that they didn't commit. And this is like, maybe I'll shoot you in the head. And then he actually does it. Just like the principal said, the boy dies in the back of the squad car. And these are like 12-year-old boys. It was horrible. And that leads to, as you can see the image in the book, if you have it in your hands, like a huge set of public demonstrations. And so that historians like Brian Beck, I'll just punch his name in here in case you want to. He teaches at Iowa State, and he's done amazing work on Latino history in Dallas. That's sort of one of the key events in that history. And yeah, that really is one of the moments that leads the city's Mexican Americans to say, like, we need to take collective action. The old tactic of, okay, well, we'll just be sort of good and nice and hope something comes to us and try not to get noticed too much, because so often getting noticed meant that someone's going to commit violence against you. And that's, again, a pivotal moment in a city that, as you may know, right, is now like 40% Latino. So it's that was at a time when it was much closer, like probably 9 or 10%. But again, that's sort of in the early years of this repopulation of the neighborhoods I'm talking about. So thank you for bringing that up. That's unforgettable tragedy. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is that kind of question of exactly how they did it, right? So what I suggest in the book, right, is that starting around 1970 in Dallas, you have a substantial repopulation of Oak Cliff and of the rest of the city by these Hispanos. Now, some of them are Mexican Americans who are migrating over from Little Mexico as the Anglo government of the city just destroys it. But then, especially as the 70s roll on, there are actual Mexicanos directly from places like Jalisco, Guanajuato, some of the major central and northern Mexican provinces that supply so many of the newcomers to Dallas, and again to so many other cities. So I'm obviously focusing on Dallas, both because my book does, but as I'll sort of try to suggest, as we get closer to the hour and 3/4 mark, is that this exact same kind of thing is happening nationwide. I have a lot of sort of charts and graphs about how that worked. But before we get to the kind of just the numbers thing, I want to talk about the qualitative, right? Numbers are like quantitative, but what about the qualitative factors? Because it's not just that 25 million new people show up or are born in American cities from families from Latin America. It's the fact that they have particular ways of operating and existing in the city. So let me go back to my PowerPoint and just talk about these. Now, let's see. The easiest way to understand this is that I'm going to talk about 3 different landscapes, what I'm calling. One is the commercial landscape, one is the transportation landscape, and one is the residential landscape. And in each case, what I'm going to suggest is that Mexicanos, and also people from Central America as well, but mostly Mexicanos, are transplanting or adapting a lot of the Mexican customs, a lot of the Mexican business arrangements, a lot of the Mexican sort of just everyday habits. They transplant them into new places in the United States, including Oak Cliff. So let me just open up this PowerPoint again, find the right spot, and talk about exactly what this means. Okay. So one of the big trends that I talked about in the urban crisis was that lots of businesses were leaving. And so far, I've talked mostly about stuff like big factories or large employers. But another way that the urban crisis and the sort of departure of people really hurts city areas is a lot of the shops are abandoned, right? A lot of storefronts that housed thriving businesses no longer do, right? So if you think back on that 1957 picture I had of Jefferson Boulevard, like every single storefront is filled and there are all these cars and pedestrians. But when people start to leave, it leaves scenes more like this one, right? Where businesses are abandoned. Now, one of the reasons, this is an image actually from Chicago, one of the reasons that these newcomers from Mexico are so effective at reviving these kinds of neighborhoods is that the small storefronts that were abandoned were no longer considered viable by Anglo businesses because you had started the road to basically to the Walmartization of the economy, right? In the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, when Anglos thought about retail, they thought, okay, we want a store of at least 200,000 square feet. We want it surrounded by acres and acres of parking. So that was the kind of stores they wanted to invest in. But downtown stores, right, that don't have dedicated parking, they just have street parking, that are often smaller, they just thought, like, you can't be profitable in those anymore. And so the era, like right before the arrival and simultaneous with the arrival of these, Mexicanos, that was the era where Anglo-owned mom and pop businesses are just getting driven out. So those old independent hardware stores, those old independent drug stores, old independent like shoe stores, old independent, there's a whole series of small kinds of stores that just get driven out of business by the big box stores, right? So what existed before Walgreens, what existed before CVS, what existed before, Home Depot, those massive stores, was a lot of small family-owned businesses. Now, that's how it worked in Anglo-America, but in Hispano-America, that's not how it worked. Remember that that this is Dallas, right? Remember that the size of businesses in Latin America was much smaller. So supermarkets caught on in America starting in like the 50s. But that didn't really happen in Mexico until the 1990s. So that means that a whole bunch of different kinds of stores that were like eliminated and sucked into the big single space of a supermarket, they still survived, right? So a carniceria, right, an independent butcher shop, those have been common in Anglo-America for years. They went away with the supermarkets. A fruteria, right, an independent fruit seller, those got sucked into the supermarkets as well. A panaderia, like any number of these small stores, gone from Anglo-America, still exist in Latin America and in Latino America. So these kinds of small storefronts work perfectly for people who are much more used to, doing business in smaller spaces. So like now looking back from the 2020s, and, if you've been to Oak Cliff to Jefferson recently, like yuppies love those small, charming stores where they can, open up their business that only sells slices of pie. But remember that for decades, those were considered totally unusable by Anglo business people. And those are the same decades that the Hispanos moved in and said, we know how to operate small businesses. And so that really is sort of what creates the possibility of ongoing vitality in the kinds of urban spaces that have been given up, for dead. So before the yuppies all come in and say, oh, we love the historical character of this building, Hispanos are like, yeah, that historical character we've been preserving for decades. So I don't know where you suddenly found it so charming after we saved it. All right. So that's landscape number one. It's the commercial landscape on Jefferson and plenty of other places survives precisely because of that sort of ability to open small businesses. And as I describe in my book, literally, if you look at any time from just over the course of years, just of decades, the most likely group to create a new business is Hispanos. Every single year from, I think they start counting this in 1989 up to 2018, with the exception of 1 or 2 years, the most new businesses are started by Hispanos, by Latinos. Okay, let me talk about the second landscape. And in some respects, this is the most important one. And this is the Latino pedestrian landscape. So remember that urban historians, urban studies people, when they talk about how has the American city changed over the past 100 years, what's the number one influence? They will always say, number one influence is the automobile, right? Cities that were built before the automobile were very dense, right? Because you could only get around either on foot or on like trolleys or trains. Indeed, Oak Cliff had a trolley until the 1950s. I think it has one again now, but there wasn't one for about 55 years. So what small, dense walking communities really create is exciting city street life, right? Where it's interesting to walk around. The way that I sometimes explain this is also like through the movies. If you watch one of those romantic comedies where like usually a guy and a girl walking around, they have like the great date, they're always sort of walking from place to place in some cool neighborhood. Now, remember that in Anglo-America, the trend has been totally in the opposite direction, starting in the 1920s, really, but really intensifying in the 1950s, where they rebuilt the landscape into a suburban landscape. And it's easy to explain this to you guys because you're from Dallas. If you go to North Dallas, if you're walking in North Dallas, like, it's not built for you. It's built for people in cars. When I lived in Dallas for the year that I was doing this research, my wife had a fellowship at SMU, and like literally, we lived in a place called, what was it, the Village. Literally, there was a huge supermarket right next door, like right across the fence, but you literally could not walk there because they had built the whole place for cars. So we literally had to get into our car, drive like a mile around the periphery of the thing, and then pull into the parking lot of the supermarket right next to us. So North Dallas is built for cars. You just, with a very few examples, very few exceptions, you can't really walk anywhere. Oak Cliff was built early enough, so it was mostly built for pedestrians. So the fact that the people repopulating the neighborhood were from Mexico, where the rate of car ownership was much lower, when they were used to settlements built around either a plaza or neighborhoods, right? Where you would walk to shop, you'd walk if you want to go to a restaurant, you'd walk to the bank. And I have a lot of stuff in chapter 10 of the book talking about like both Mexicans and Mexican Americans saying like, well, one of the reasons we love Oak Cliff is you can actually walk from place to place. And a lot of the restaurant and business owners along Jefferson Boulevard is like, there is not nearly, quote unquote, enough parking here by Anglo standards, but it works really well because the Mexicanos are mostly living a couple of blocks away. They've got like a little cart or something that they'll push and they'll do their shopping on foot. So just to give you an example of so this is not just sort of a story of like, oh, Anglos are this way and Hispanos are that way. I went and looked at the automobile ownership rates as recorded by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they went in 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. And so I compared like, what's the rate of car ownership? In 1960, the rate of car ownership in the United States was 18 times higher than it was in Mexico, right? So really, these are people that don't like climb into their car to go 3 blocks to go to a store. Even in 2010, when they did that number again, the number was still 5 times higher in the United States as opposed to Mexico. I think it's 812 vehicles per 1,000 people in Mexico, and I think, in the United States, and 162 in Mexico. Moreover, if you look at the actual like little pueblitos that these people were mostly coming from, the car ownership was even lower there. So there's a town called Tzintzuntzan in Michoacan where anthropologists have gone and visited like for decades and decades. And, they found that in 1945, none of the 350 residents of Tzintzuntzan owned a car. 10 years later, it'd be like there'd be 2 cars. 10 years after that, it'd be like 11 automobiles out of a town of a few hundred people, right? So this is sort of a very clear difference. And it's why these barrios work economically and why in lots and lots of cities, the only growing part of many cities, for example, Detroit, is what they call Mexican town, right? So it's sort of a very effective, very successful method of essentially working with, creating, and acting in urban space. So that's the second one. The third one I want to talk about in terms of these imported landscapes is the housescape, right? And this is the way that Mexican Americans in particular, these are images from a book by a guy named, an article by a guy named Daniel Arreola. And Daniel Arreola is a historian of geography. He's now retired. He was at, I think, San Diego State for many years. And he said, essentially, what you often see when you go to a Mexican-American neighborhood is a combination of the sort of Anglo house and the more Mexican house. So on the left there, you see the classic Mexican courtyard house, which is built around the periphery of a property with the courtyard inside, right? And the courtyard was where everyone would kind of gather, but sleeping quarters, kitchen, bathroom, everything, that was out on the periphery. By contrast, the Anglo-American house is usually a freestanding house right in the middle of the property. And so when he says, when Mexicanos move in, they will often put up a perimeter fence around the edge, and they will often use that front yard a lot during the day socially. Now remember that these are sort of images from Chicago. Remember that starting in about the 1970s, Anglo-American sociologists began to freak out about what they called the privatization of the public. They said, increasingly where people used to go to a municipal pool to swim, these days they'll go to they'll have a pool in their backyard, or when they used to go to go to the movies at a big movie palace or a movie house. Now they've got their home theaters. And so there's a book called The Fall of Public Man from 1978. There's a book called The Lost City from 1995. There's a book called Bowling Alone from 2000. And the basic message is the same, which is that people are turning away from their neighbors, turning away from their streets, and making their lives in their houses or in their backyards. And they said this is a big crisis for cities. And that's true when you're talking about middle-class Anglo-American people. But in Latino America, in Mexican America, it's just the opposite, right? People often would begin to use the front yards of their streets, especially for their kids. They wanted to have some sort of zone where it was safe, where the kids would not run out into the street and maybe get hit by a car, but that they could be watched over by the parents, by the abuelos. And so this is called La Yarda, right? It's like a Spanglish term, like a combination of the yard and Spanish. So it's called La Yarda. And these are examples in a neighborhood in Chicago. And you can see a lot of similar use of chain link fences around a house in the middle. This is, again, a hybrid Mexican-American landscape. And I should say that it's not just I went and found some good examples. If you walk up and down Little Village in Chicago, you just see this block after block after block after block is people using their front yards. Now, this combines with one of the sort of, I think, most interesting and important effects of Latino-led urban revitalization. Remember I was saying that there were very high murder rates peaking in 1991? After that, for about 25 years, the murder rate plunged, amazingly so. And what people have found, criminologists have found, is that this essentially is an almost inevitable concomitant of immigration, right? So again, I have some detail on this in chapter 10 of my book. If you want an article by this guy at Harvard named Robert Sampson, if you just punch in, it's called Rethinking Crime and Immigration. And here, I'll put it in the chat. Robert Sampson, Rethinking, I think it's Immigration and Crime. And it's a short article, just 5 pages, that gives you a clear idea of how social scientists know that immigration drives crime down. What they don't necessarily know is how does it work at the micro level. And I met this guy a few years ago at a conference. I said, the work is amazing. You've been publishing it, starting in the 2010s. Do you have some sense of why it is that crime goes down when immigrants move in? And he said, that we're not sure of. People have very generalized theories, like the kind of people that emigrate usually just want to come here and work. There's, remember that the United States is an unusually violent place. So people from almost anywhere are on average going to be less violent than Americans. And I said, have you considered La Yarda? And I said, basically what La Yarda is it's a method of public surveillance of the street, right? So when somebody is considering robbing a house or committing a crime, one thing they do not want is to be seen doing it. But when you've got these streets lined with these yardas, with the kids in the front and the parents or the abuelos, And when you have a neighborhood that has lots and lots of small stores, there are lots of people watching. Now, I didn't just make this up recently. This is actually a classic piece of urban history and urban sociology that comes from 1961. There was a woman, an activist named Jane Jacobs. And this is sort of a story of trying to keep a city from destroying a neighborhood. Greenwich Village in Manhattan, in New York City, is like a super valuable, very prestigious neighborhood. And lots of folks want to live there. It's wildly expensive now, but back in the 1950s, it was mostly immigrants and the descendants of immigrants, like the kids and grandkids. And New York City wanted to put a highway right through it. And Jane Jacobs was one of the people that organized to make sure it did not happen. It was sort of an early success in the revolt against all these highways. And she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which I talk about in my book. It's like, if you go to Amazon.com's, like, here are the leading books on urban studies, Death and Life of Great American Cities is still there, even though it's like 60 years old this year. And what she said was, it's not police that mostly prevent crime from happening. It's eyes upon the street. It's people just watching, so that, again, it's not the highly dense downtown parts of the city that are most dangerous. So I just said, like, this is just a different version of eyes upon the street. It's, like ojos in this case, but it works the same. So when sociologists try to figure out why does crime fall when immigrants move in, and this is true of Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, but it's true of immigrants from literally anywhere in the world, at least in the Hispano neighborhoods, I think this is one of the answers. So again, to conclude this part of it, the Latino commercial landscape, the Latino pedestrian landscape, and the Latino landscape of home, those all sort of combine in ways that really revitalize neighborhoods very effectively. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Well, Mr. Sandoval, I have a question. So I really like the argument that you make that Latinos are revitalizing these communities, or that they bring back American cities. But to me, it kind of seems like, the story about Little Mexico, it seems like it's happening again, right? I look at Oak Cliff and I see that there's a lot of change happening. And I was wondering what your take is on that. And I know that many of the students see that as well. They see the change in culture, the change in businesses. And it seems like it's only affecting a certain group of people, while it's hurting the people who have made this community, what it is today. So I was just wondering what your take is on that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because gentrification is one of the big trends. Again, like it's sort of weird and ironic and strange to people when I talk about this, because the biggest problem in a lot of big cities today is that they've become too expensive for a lot of working people to live in, because rents have gotten so high and the cost of housing has gotten so high. And that's a relatively new development, right? Like I said, anytime from the 1960s through the early 1990s, the idea that, like, where's the future? Downtown and in the neighborhoods of big cities, that would have been seen as totally crazy. So, what we've had for about the past 20 years is this substantial movement of mostly white professional people who want to seek out, not the boring suburbs, but neighborhoods with character, neighborhoods with personality, places that are close to their work, because now a lot of work is relocated back into cities. So there's sort of a theory of what has caused the recovery of cities. Oh, it's the white yuppies who moved back in. And I'll get back to why that's just simply could never have happened if not for the arrival of all these Hispanos first, right? It is true that they tend to seek out, again, cool neighborhoods. And barrios are often considered cool neighborhoods because that walking culture, that sort of small pre-automobile urban scene, it's built to human scale. It's built for face-to-face interaction. There's all these beautiful old buildings from In Chicago, it's anywhere from the 1890s to the 1930s. In Dallas, it's anywhere from the 19 teens, right, to the 1930s or 40s, that are really highly sought after. So what you have is these working class Hispano neighborhoods that suddenly start to get much more expensive, and developers start to build yuppie habit trail housing. And you can see that right in Oak Cliff, like everywhere north, especially of Jefferson Boulevard, around the Bishop Arts District. They're building all these kind of loft housing for rich white people. And it's hard to know how to respond to that, because it is unmistakably a danger to the fabric of these neighborhoods. But at the same time, it's a little tricky to get too moralistic about it, because some of the property owners are just simply Mexican Americans or Mexicans who moved here decades ago and paid, literally $15,000 for a building in the 1970s. And somebody now is just like, hey, I'll give you $2 million for your building. It can be hard for them to say no. It can mean the dissolution of the neighborhood, but there's just a lot of economic pressures which drive them to do that. So what really is required is to find a way to continue to make it more profitable, or just a sense that this neighborhood is important to us, right? So for example, in Little Village in Chicago, the Barrio that sort of grew out of the older neighborhood of South Lawndale, a lot of the property owners are just saying, like, I'm not selling this property. This is who we are. This is something we created, and we have to stay here. And similarly, at the end of the book, I quote a lot of more recent journalism about Oak Cliff, and you have guys like Teresa Ortiz, right, who owns a place called Casa Guanajuato, which has this, sort of centro de boxeo, and he says, here it comes, and it's tempting to sell, but they essentially want to drive us all out. What you really need is to organize politically and to change the zoning rules to make it possible for people to continue to live there, right? And there are, a number of activists. There a guy named Giovanni Valderas, who's a creator of the Casitas Tristes, who's sort of been fighting against this. And I should say, thankfully, this is not kind of a mystery, in the sense that this was a movie that was supposed to come out in 2020, but in the Heights, right? By the creator of Hamilton, right? Lin-Manuel Miranda. His first musical was In the Heights. It came out it first was performed in 2000 and became a multi-Tony Award-winning play in 2008. And this isn't too much of a spoiler because it's right there in the trailer. But the whole story is of Washington Heights, an old, like, German, Jewish, Irish immigrant neighborhood in New York that becomes a Dominican, Puerto Rican neighborhood in the 1980s and 1990s. But then, right, all the yuppies want to move in. So it's sort of about the survival and the maintenance of a neighborhood like this under the economic pressure of gentrification. So this is, and maybe now is a good place to to talk about how generalized this is. So I've been talking about Oak Cliff, but this same process happens in Mexican Town in Detroit, in Washington Heights in New York, in the South Bronx in New York, in Little Village in Dallas, in the Kennett Square area outside Philadelphia or in Philadelphia, in the Fifth Street corridor in North Philly, in the entire Lake Street neighborhood, in Minneapolis, in the sort of Mexican American areas of Milwaukee, in I'm trying to remember the name of the square in Hartford, Connecticut. Like, this is a nationwide thing in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, where so many of these things happened earlier, right? So it's a national thing. And I try to emphasize, right, that if you want to talk about the recovery of the city and the maintenance of the city, if you look at the 25 biggest cities in America right now, 2 of those cities are majority Latino, 8 of those cities are 1/3 or more Latino, and 13 of those cities are 1/4 or more Latino, right? So let me pull up just some graphs for you real quick to give you like the grand sense of how this works, because I think it's important to see that this is, what's happening in Oak Cliff and in Dallas is a national story. Okay, here we go. And I promise to keep an eye on the time. Let's see if we can share screen. And again, because it's right there in the book, and one of those is available to any of you who wants one. But these are the. Oh, let me do that. I think it'll take a second to share. There we go, and slideshow. So these are the graphs that I made for Chicago and Dallas, the two main cities that I look at in my book. And right, you can see that if you look at the population of Chicago, this sort of bottom area is non-Hispanic whites. This is African Americans, and this upper area is Latinos, right? And I have one both for Chicago and for Dallas. What you can see is that over time, white people have simply been moving out of Dallas. White people have been simply moving out of Chicago. So in terms of who is maintaining the city, they're becoming more African American and Latino. But note here, right, in Chicago, that the number of Black people is also shrinking, right? Because with the passage of civil rights laws that allowed African Americans to get mortgages in the suburbs, many of them moved out as well, looking for whatever, better schools or bigger houses. And then after that, there was a sort of a tendency to move back to the old southern cities that many of their ancestors had fled in the 19-teens and the 1940s. So, you're noticing the sudden change in voting laws in Georgia. One of the reasons for that is that lots of Black people moved from big cities in the north back to Georgia and started voting the way that they wanted to vote. And so as you notice, something a little bit different happened with Georgia than had happened in every presidential election before that for decades. By the same token, right? So here is the numbers for Dallas, that you have sort of growing African American population in Dallas for some years, but then it's pretty stable from 1990 to 2010. The number of people that are really growing is up here in the Hispanos, right? You go from only 63,000 Latinos in Dallas to 500,000 by 2010. And remember, those are almost always undercounts. By the same token, in Chicago, you go from 250,000 Hispanos, right, in 1970 to 750,000, almost 800,000 in 2010, and that number has continued to grow. Now, let me also, got to get back to that PowerPoint. A great thing happened is that, so these are my graphs, but then when the New York Times wrote an article about my book and a couple of other scholars who have been doing this, they essentially recreated the same graphs for other cities. And they said, here's Dallas, where you can see more clearly, orange is the Hispanos, non-Hispanic white here, African American here. I broke out Asian and Native American populations specifically because it's important that everybody be represented in their part in this process. New York Times was not as good at it, but you can still see the broad trends, right? So that Dallas, were it not for the arrival of all these Hispanos, Dallas would still be shrinking. It would be in crisis. Same thing with Houston, virtually all the population growth. Same thing with Los Angeles. Without those orange parts of the bar, these would be either stagnant or shrinking cities. There are a couple of exceptions. Oklahoma City, Phoenix would be growing a little bit without them as well, but those are the Sun Belt cities like Dallas. If you look at, again, cities like Boston, New York, their populations would be stagnant if it were not for the growing Hispano population. Chicago is still shrinking, but it's really stabilized for the past 20 years, again, because of mostly Mexicanos moving in. Same deal with Milwaukee, Philadelphia. So I wrote this book by focusing on Dallas and Chicago because they're really terrific examples, but this is really a national trend, so that almost anywhere you go, you see urban revitalization being that result of the new people who are arriving. We're down to about our last 12 minutes, so let me pause and see if there are questions, comments, responses, et cetera. Oh yeah, the don't get me started, but I don't get why the white privilege love our food but hate us. That's a really important, interesting point. I think the thing to remember, just because, especially from 2016 to 2020, it was like I would read the news every day like a horror movie, like watching it through my fingers, because so much brutality was being handed out to migrants and immigrants. And I think that the politics of it are really important to remember geographically. The short version here is the people who live near the most immigrants tend to be the people who are the most pro-immigrant. So as annoying as yuppies can be, they're at least not voting for people like, for anti-immigrant crazies, right? Like the white population is roughly evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, and it's mostly about education and geography. College-educated people are much more likely to vote pro-immigrant parties, populations, much more likely to vote Democratic. People without a college education who are white, most likely to vote for people like Trump, basically. In addition, so like that's the education effect. Geographically, white people in cities most likely to vote for Democrats, right? So one of the big transformations, especially in Texas politics, is that metro areas like Dallas used to be solid Republican areas, except for where Black people lived and Hispanos lived, right? Metropolitan areas, including Dallas, are now like the part of growing blue Dallas. So I'm sure that you guys have all been keeping an eye on the politics in Texas, because the Texas legislature has been trying to do the same kind of things as the Georgia legislature, right? Texas is now one of 4 minority majority states, right? Texas, California, New Mexico, and Hawaii, in which non-Hispanic whites are an actual minority of the total population. Get even more pronounced because the average age of a white person is like 47, and the average age of an Hispano is like 29. So seeing that the population figures are not headed in their favor, realizing that in an equal election where everyone gets to vote, they're going to lose. They're starting up, frankly, a new era of Jim Crow. And in places like Georgia, it's mostly against Black people. But in places like Arizona and Texas, it's mostly about us because we're the fastest growing population. So that sort of scramble to say, oh, let's make it as hard as possible. Let's, find ways to gerrymander the state legislature. Those are responses to precisely the process I'm talking about. Because the cities of America is the future of all of America. The other great irony and the other great tragedy of this is that America is in desperate need of immigrants. Demographers have known this for years, but a lot of folks don't, is that native-born Americans of any race, creed, background, etc., but native-born Americans do not make enough babies to maintain our population, right? Each family has to have essentially 2.1, like the replacement rate is 2.1 kids per family. Falling below that means that you're headed into an era where you don't have enough new workers, don't have enough new students, don't have enough new anything. And America is fully into that. And indeed, the COVID crisis has made that even worse, because there have been a lot of people who, some people have been having more babies, and God bless them, but most people have not. And so we're looking at a future where we don't have enough Americans. The only thing that over the past 20 years has been keeping our population up is immigrants and their kids having more kids, right? Now let's zoom out one more time. This is definitely a problem we have in the United States. Is why a recent study said we essentially need to accept 350,000 more immigrants per year than we did before the Trump administration, is the number we should be at, right? So when people say, oh, this border crisis, it's like, actually what we should do is let these people in, give them all green cards and let them work, because we need them, right? The agricultural workforce of America is about 50% undocumented. Those people have been working here for years and deserve to be US citizens. So I said I was zooming out, right? So this is definitely a challenge for America, which is exactly the opposite of the quote unquote crisis that you see on the news. But this is happening throughout the industrialized world. So people who are like, oh, we could just turn this around by, I don't know, like play more romantic music on the radio or something. The same problem is happening in Japan. The same problem is happening in Russia. The same problem is happening in Germany. The same problem is happening in Italy. Throughout the advanced post-industrial world, people are choosing to have fewer kids. And that, again, would be a crisis, but thankfully, immigration. Now, that's worked really well for us. It's worked well for Germany, because after the United States, which is the most, American immigrants is the biggest population of immigrants in the world. There are 45 million foreign-born people here, documented, undocumented, citizens, not citizens, 45 million people. The next biggest population is only a quarter as big. It's 10 million. It's in Germany. Then after that, it's in Russia. It's exactly the countries that are, for the most part, most desperately in need of immigrants, right, that have big immigrant populations. Unfortunately, you've had this xenophobic backlash, but there simply is no other way to handle this. So it's been really sad to see people on Fox News and people on, other networks, saying this is a crisis, this immigration thing. I'm thinking, like, this is like a person who is starving to death, and you say, hey, here's some food, and they're like, no, I'm going to push that away across the table. And you say, what is wrong with you that this is what you need more than anything? But
well, do you think an immigration reform, or like at least accepting more migrants into the country, would at least slow down this gentrification? Because there'd be more people that you'd have to push out in order to take over these smaller communities.
Again, I think the way that anti-immigrant people misunderstand it is precisely right. They don't realize these migrantes are going to be here. The only question is, are they going to be here legally or not legally, right? And that's why again, if you Google Sandoval-Strausz no-brainer, it'll bring up a Washington Post piece that I did about 3 weeks ago, which is precisely about how we know that legalizing 11 million people would be a benefit economically, socially, not just to those people, all the communities around them. And I should say that this year is the 30th anniversary of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which was, in most respects, not a very good law, but it had the amnesty, which allowed 2.7 million people, mostly Mexican, to become legal residents. That was the biggest success of that entire law, and we should do it again. The only thing standing in the way is ignorance and prejudice. Well, also as a reminder, please, everyone go register and vote, please, 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 please. There is a clear majority in favor of immigration reform. It's just the obstructionists in the US Senate. That is the only thing standing in the way. In 2013, right, a law was passed through one house of Congress that had 75% support, but they didn't put it on the floor. It couldn't get a vote. So, raising our voices, getting registered, and saying this is something we should do. We should respect the will of the majority of American people. Again, just like read the last chapter of my book when you get your copy. It's all about how this is not something that, the American people don't want. It's something that we do. It's the problem is the politicians that don't respect our wishes.
And it was without the Latino vote, we wouldn't have Biden as our president right now. They kind of flipped it in certain key states such as Arizona.
Right, exactly. People talk a lot about Arizona that went blue for the first time. That's a big deal, and that's probably a harbinger of the future, which is why Arizona is trying to restrict the vote. The same thing, you don't think of Georgia as a place with a big Hispano population, but it is one. And another state that people don't talk a lot about, Pennsylvania, where I live. There are almost 1 million Latinos in Pennsylvania. The net gain to Joe Biden, I think, was 100,000 votes. A lot of the Hispanos here are Puerto Rican, and they tend to be, pretty left-leaning, pretty liberal, pretty democratic voting. in a state that Biden won by 80,000 votes, 100,000 net votes because of the Hispanos, right? That's really important. So again, the reason that there is a nationwide attempt to restrict the vote is because they know what will happen if the people have their say fairly. Like as others have mentioned, since 1988, Republicans have won the popular vote in a presidential contest how many times? Show me with your fingers. Guess. How many times? Once. Democrats won the majority in 1992, 1996, 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. The sudden surge of voter repression and voter suppression is not a mistake. It's a racist panic, quite simply. You want to say, like in a more generous way, oh, well, people misunderstand this or that, and it's just about economic pressure or anxiety. I'd love to believe that, because then you could convince people, hey, it's good for everyone. But when it's a racial anxiety about who is going to replace whom, it's a little hard to reason with folks. So we just have to get out and do it ourselves.
Karen had a question that you may have missed in the chat, but she was wondering how you might compare, and I assume this is for Mexican Americans, Mexican population, in Chicago versus Dallas, if there's a big difference there.
Let's see. So,
the exact phrasing was, how would you compare life in Chicago and Dallas?
Life in Chicago. I mean, it's pretty similar. Well, I'll put it this way: Chicago is a stable city. Dallas is a growing city. Both of them are incredibly important to their state economies. Nationally, about 75% of the GNP is what they call the GDP now, is generated in or around cities. So these are places that are essential to the national economy. In terms of voting, I actually went back and looked at the 2020 results of election in all of the political precincts right around Oak Cliff and right around Little Village. The margin, and I'm not talking about the vote totals, the margins for Joe Biden in the middle of Little Village were margins of 60 to 70%, right? So massive margins. Those are not actually as big as 2016, but they're huge. There was a lot of reportage about how Trump strangely did better among Latinos in 2020 than in 2016. That's not untrue. But again, like if I look at the Philadelphia precincts, it'll be like, whoa, Biden got 85% of the vote instead of 90, instead of Clinton getting 90%. People are suddenly moving to Trump. It's like, again, the margins are different, but still pretty overwhelmingly a pro-democratic group. To contrast or compare Dallas and Chicago, the neighborhood in Chicago is pretty much about 70 to 80% margin for Biden, right? So again, there's some folks that voted in a way that I did not expect, but that does not change the sort of macro forecast that people under 18 right now are majority minority nationally, right? And people under 18 are something like 35 to 40% just Latino. So this is not something that can be avoided.
We are kind of at when I said that we would be wrapping up and everything, but I do want to, leave time if anyone wants to stay for a couple more minutes, ask a final question, since you are here, open the floor, but also, we might have some students kind of leaving and maybe some faculty as well.
Sure. I totally understand. And listen, before you do go, if you have to go, thank you so much for coming. This was fantastic. If there's any questions I can answer, just email sandoval@psu.edu. I am happy to help out folks from the Oak Cliff area because, again, it's meant everything to the work I've done as a historian. So thank you for you and your families and everything you've done.
Well, yeah, we want to extend our gratitude as well. Sending the books to all of the Mexican American students, just being so open and willing. I think you even mentioned that you would come out to Dallas if we invited you to. But yeah, just so many thanks to you for just shedding light on the community and also some of the different issues going around. I did add a link to Giovanni's kind of page, his election page. So if you guys want to see sort of what the community and what different community members are doing to try to maintain the community and to preserve the history in the community of Oak Cliff, you can totally get involved, even if you're not of voting age. Definitely reach out, and I'm sure Mr. Macias and I will be kind of sharing some more information about local elections and local events and community discussions.
They can't even afford a house in the hood, because they're getting so expensive. So, what does the future look like? Where are the Juanitas, the Grecias, the students that come to this school? Where are they going to live at? Are they going to live in a more diverse community? Are they going to be able to live in the community that they grew up in? Or are they going to be having to look, farther out from the central business district because it's just getting so expensive? So what do you think the future holds?
Again, remember that ideally you want to be able to stay in the neighborhood you consider yours. You can always create a new one, right? Some of the discussions in some neighborhoods are where can we go next? But I would say, remember this, the overall trend, again, is that larger and larger parts of cities are occupied by Latinos. It's not as if there's only one neighborhood that one can live in. So, for example, the neighborhood I look at in Chicago, Little Village, it is gentrifying, but the next suburb to the west, the next suburb to the northwest, the next suburb to the southwest, the next urban south, and the one after that, the one.
It's been one of my favorite subjects. Growing up in San Antonio, going back and forth, but whole employee, I work every election in the city of Dallas, Dallas County, wherever I can go. And in the last few years, we've had high school students work in the polls, and they get paid like $10 an hour or something. So I am, obviously you won't be old enough to vote, but you will be old enough to work those polls. And you will see what Dr. Sandoval is talking about, just the Hispanics that literally stand at the door first to see if someone's there that can help them. But a lot of them can vote, and it angers me, of course, that no one is out there. I mean, if you're in your neighborhood, I go knock on doors, and even if they don't know me, they're like, oh, I didn't know you were there. I didn't know I could get help. And this last election, oh my gosh, I spent the whole time speaking Spanish because there were so many Latinos, and I was in Lancaster, people voting. I'm like, where have you been? Oh, we've lived here. But they don't know that. So kiddos, if you guys are in Dallas, go call the elections office. The wonderful lady over that department is a friend of mine from a long time ago. And she would be so happy. I think they're paying $12 an hour now, but money is money, and we all need it. And I don't know, if I had grown up here in Dallas, city of Dallas, I'd been all over the place. But we came out to the country because, like I mentioned, my father was not allowed to come in to work anywhere in Dallas. He always worked out in the ranchos and, out in south of Dallas County. I didn't know that until we started going to Wilmer Hutchins School District schools, and I started seeing I was a white girl there. So please, guys, thank you, Nancy, for inviting me. But I thank you for being here, and thank you for bringing this up. And I have family in Chicago too.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you, though. I'm glad I was invited. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
this.
Yeah, thank you again. Does anyone have any final questions? Well, my internet is getting a little spotty as well, so this might be a good time to say goodbye. Again, we want to extend our thanks on behalf of the whole school, and I've recorded this, so any students who missed it, or let's say you came in late, or maybe your internet was spotty and you came in and out, the recording will be up there, and I will share it with Mr. Macias, and whoever else wants to watch it as well can review all the information. And again, thank you so much. And we'll probably be ordering, more of your books. It sounds like there's a lot more interest on this than before.
We might, if we, from the principal, if we do, I was thinking, we're thinking of picking a book a year. So I don't know, maybe when times get better, we would love to have you in the future if we do that. And it's nothing like getting local history, because the kids can make a connection to that. And so I just, again, I appreciate you really for making that effort, but I was thinking of doing something of that nature where we put, a yearly book for each group. I would love to have you out when that's possible, right? Hopefully in the near future, or possibly.
I got my first vaccine 2 days ago, so anytime after May 1st.
Okay, yeah.
Any year.
I hear you. I got the second one 2 days ago. I had to recover yesterday, but I'm good today.
Yeah. All right. But I will be there whenever you want me to. En serio.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sandoval, for all the information that you gave the students.
Thank you to all of you.
I really appreciate it. Muchas gracias.
Igual.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Sandoval-Strausz again. I'll reach back out to you via email, but again, this meant so much to all of us. Thank you.
Ha sido un placer.
Bye.